Just as Jacob expected, Susan was cultivating in her room. She knew it was Jacob when she heard his voice.
"Miss Susan."
The 4 female cultivators slightly bowed toward Susan.
"Go and get some rest."
Susan waved them off and beckoned Jacob to follow her. Susan closed the door behind Jacob. Then she sat down on her bed and asked,
"What is the matter?"
Jacob looked at Susan carefully and realized that she seemed much healthier and livelier than last time. He knew that Susan must have recovered from her injuries well. "I didn't have a chance to come over during the day, so I had to come here at night. I mainly wanted to tell you about this situation," Jacob said straightforwardly. "There have been more and more human cultivators coming to First Heaven, from Fifth Heaven and up, lately. I caught 2 of them, and I let them go because I mistook them as dragon cultivators." Susan nodded. She thought to herself for a few seconds and said,
"There have always been human cultivators probing around First Heaven. Actually, we would scout around Fifth Heaven as well from time to time. The human and dragon cultivators keep the boundaries, but periodic monitoring is necessary."
"Has it only become frequent for our city, or are all the cities like this?" Jacob asked. He was an assisting inspector after all, and Susan knew more information from the Dragon God Shrine.
"No special information has been received about other cities. It is probably because I am currently recovering here and there isn't an official inspector guarding the city. Thus, the human cultivators have increased the range and frequency of their inspections,"
Susan said, after thinking for a bit with her head down. "Okay, I'll patrol regularly. How should I deal with the human cultivators once I catch them?" Jacob continued. He thought Susan would only be recovering in the North Atlantic Dragon Palace for a few days. However, she had decided to stay for a while. She hadn't had a chance to discuss a lot of things with Jacob.
"You can just let them go, or you could give them a little punishment,"
Susan said. "I see." Jacob nodded and said, "If there's nothing else I need to know, I should head back." He knew that Susan didn't like to hear nonsense, so it made sense for him to leave on his own before she kicked him out since he had nothing else to report.
"Wait for a second,"
Susan called out when Jacob turned around and walked to the door. Jacob turned around to look at her. Susan looked a bit uneasy sitting at the side of her bed as Jacob looked at her. After a moment of silence, she gritted her teeth and said,
"I'm aware of what's going on with you."
Jacob froze in his spot for a moment. Susan continued, since Jacob didn't say anything,
"My suggestion is to cope with changes by sticking to fundamental principles. It sure is a messy situation, and even I won't be able to help you out here. The South Atlantic Dragon Clan is now a lot less powerful, but their reputation and influence are still here. The North Atlantic Dragon Clan might choose to make minor sacrifices to safeguard major interests. It would be the most rational way to deal with things."
Jacob nodded, since his thoughts were the same as Susan's. Severing ties with him would indeed help the North Atlantic Dragon Clan to stabilize itself in this chaos. After a few more seconds of silence, Susan continued.
"I also need to remind you that the Dragon God Shrine is paying attention to the situation. There is no point talking about the kid. Even the Dragon God Shrine wouldn't dare to offend him. Therefore, the core of this entire event is you. Although the Dragon God Shrine has its rules, it respects strength. The general examination of the Dragon God Shrine will be taking place soon. Let me put it this way. If you can successfully become an official inspector, the Dragon God Shrine surely will step out and protect you. But if you fail, your assisting inspector position will be withdrawn, and it will impact my position as well."
Jacob didn't mind the first half of what Susan said, but her last sentence shocked him.
this incident will impact Susan's position as well? He thought.
What kind of impact? Jacob asked.
The lightest punishment would be transferring me out of the city to some remote area like where Tom is right now. The most severe punishment... Susan smiled helplessly and said, "You don't need to know about it."
Jacob had no clue that this would affect Susan. Since this was a family issue that should be kept inside the North Atlantic Dragon Clan between him and Sophie, it wouldn't be fair to drag Susan into it. Susan took him as her assistant in order to provide him with protection under another identity. But now, Jacob felt incredibly sorry for Susan, who looked calm at the moment. She offered him patient instructions and teachings when Jacob just started cultivating, and she never treated him poorly, let alone the fact that Susan got injured while protecting him when they were pushed out of the Nine Dragon Palace by Thomas. Susan smiled lightly when she saw Jacob's gloomy face.
"Don't overthink this. Since I am in the inspector system, I will accept the Dragon God Shrine's decision."
She looked so calm that it felt like she wouldn't regret any of her decisions, even if she were severely punished. As a matter of fact, although Susan didn't drop in level from this serious injury, her combat abilities were not as powerful as before. It would take her at least 5 or 6 years to recover from the incident. Otherwise, even the Dragon God Shrine wouldn't want to punish an 8th level inspector who was good at the job, like Susan.
"Okay, I will do my best in the Dragon God Shrine's examinations,"
Jacob said with determination. Although Susan looked cold, she tried to protect him wherever she could. Jacob remembered her kindness, and it was now time for him to shield her from troubles and liabilities.
"The general examinations of the Dragon God Shrine is not as easy as you might think,"
Susan smiled and said, shaking her head. However, she didn't keep talking. She didn't think that Jacob could get a good placement with his strength, but she didn't want to crush his enthusiasm. In her opinion, Jacob's current progress was already speedy and smooth. "When does the examination start exactly?" Jacob asked.
"Technically, you have a month if you really plan to take the exams,"
Susan informed him. "Okay." Jacob gritted his teeth and nodded. Susan secretly sighed at how persistent Jacob was. The South Atlantic Dragon Clan was determined to fight until death, and it pulled all the forces together, becoming the key force in the fight against North Atlantic. It made the Dragon God Shrine nervous as well, and the Dragon God Shrine had to take some actions to calm the whole situation down. As Jacob's boss, she would definitely have to go somewhere like Antarctica for a decade. She wouldn't even be allowed to go back home during that time.
"You should head back if there's nothing else,"
Susan looked at Jacob and said. Jacob thought about the time and realized that he did spend quite a while in Susan's room. Therefore, he nodded and walked to the door. "Anyways, get better soon," he said. Susan nodded without showing any expression. He left there with more things to think about. He didn't care much about the inspector position, but since this involved Susan, it was no longer an issue within the North Atlantic Dragon Clan. There were always some patrolling soldiers tailing him. "Let General Arthur know that I'll pay him a visit some other day," Jacob said to the golden-armored soldier who was leading the patrolling soldiers. Then he whipped out Snowflake and headed onto the land at a fast speed. General Arthur was the only one who had a personal friendship with Jacob in the entire Dragon Palace. Jacob decided not to bother him tonight since it was already after midnight. However, if he had some questions about the North Atlantic that needed to be answered, General Arthur would be the perfect person. Sophie has started her cultivation again, and maybe the loss of her dragon core would no longer be a problem. I might just be an insignificant prince. Jacob laughed, self-deprecatingly as he patted Snowflake's neck with both hands. Snowflake sped up immediately, dashing out of the ocean like a shooting star. The ocean looked limitless under the moonlight. As if it sensed Jacob's mood, Snowflake lowered itself near the ocean in an attempt to cheer him up, and its paws almost touched the water. The strong airflow created by the fast speed made a lot of waves in the ocean. Giant fishes that were swimming near the surface got sucked out of the ocean, and they kept rolling up and down in the air. There was an endless ocean all around him. "Come on, Snowflake, let's head back," Jacob smiled and said after a while. Snowflake roared as it suddenly flew forward, dashing into the reflection of the moon in the ocean. They arrived back at the karaoke place in just a moment, and Snowflake turned into its little puppy form. After putting Snowflake back into the necklace, Jacob returned to the room his friends were in. He looked at the time and realized that it had only been half an hour. By now, almost all the guys were cuddling up on the couch, sleeping. "You are back!" Ryan, who was still somehow awake and singing, exclaimed. Jacob just smiled at his friend and joined him in singing and trying to wake up the rest of them.